Alright, morning guys. Welcome back to the shop. This week I'm going to go over the details of cutting dovetail joinery. I'm going to show you all the basic tools you'll need and try to explain in as much detail as I can how to do it and how to use each one of these tools. There's a bunch of different ways of cutting dovetails. Everybody kind of has their own technique. What I'm going to show you today is what I think is the easiest way of doing it. I have seen other ways and I've done it a lot of other ways. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you've probably seen me do it in a bunch of different ways. And you may never have actually seen me do it this way. But this is a really basic way. It's kind of what I would think of as like a beginner's way, a good introduction to dovetails. But I'm going to go over these tools first. So this is what I would kind of consider to be a basic toolkit for cutting dovetails. I would actually consider this main group here to be your layout tools. So what you're going to need is some way to mark the wood, and a marking knife is the best way to do that, because a pencil, you've probably seen me use a pencil a bunch on my channel, but I do that usually so that you can see the lines that I'm making. But if I was doing it myself and I wasn't trying to show anybody anything, I would exclusively use a marking knife, because the thickness of a line that I'm going to get by this knife edge is a fraction of what I'm going to get from the thickness of a pencil from pencil lead. So that extra thickness you're getting from the pencil lead when you're making a mark with a pencil is going to cause inaccuracies in your cuts. So the finer of a line you can put on something, the more accurate of a line you're going to get. And that's where a marking knife really helps a lot. Now, you're going to need to know the angle of the dovetails that you're cutting, and that these brass dovetail guides are pretty handy for that. You can get them in wood, or you can make them yourself out of wood. The problem is when you're cutting your lines with your marking knife, you can easily cut into a piece of wood or even plastic. I've seen these made out of plastic. It's the same thing. You're going to cut into it, you're going to nick it, and over time it's going to not be the angle that you're actually trying to get. So I prefer these brass ones just because I'm not going to damage this by using my marking knife. And these are going to come in a bunch of different angles. I think this one's a 1 in 5 and this is a 1 in 8. So I typically go for the 1 in 8 just because I think it looks better to have this more narrow pin than it would to have a thicker pin. But yeah, I mean, you're going to see them in a bunch of different sizes, and you could, like I said, if you make them yourself out of wood, you could make it any size you want. But something like that, some kind of way to mark out the angle for your tails and pins is going to be important to have. Another thing that's going to be important is a square, so that when you do figure out where your lines are going to be, you can use your square to actually square those lines around the entire surface of your board. And then for this method specifically that I'm going to be showing you today, you're going to need a compass. And that's because a lot of times you're not going to know, even if you know the width of the board you're using, to divide it into the amount of sections you need. Let's say you want to cut three dovetails, 3 tails specifically. To divide that number in your head, it's going to end up being complicated, because the width of the board, the total width of the board, is not going to be exact, and it's going to be some odd number. To get the exact proper width of tails, just by figuring it up in your head, can be pretty complicated. And that's where this is going to come in, because you can just kind of guess more or less the width of your dovetails. Check your guess against the board itself, and then adjust this in or out depending on how many tails you're going to be cutting and how accurate your guess is. But you'll see that actually in action here in a minute. But once you get all your tails and pins laid out, then it's going to be time to actually cut your tails and pins. So you're going to want a dovetail saw, and this is a gent saw, which is just a cheap version of a dovetail saw. But you're going to need something like this to cut down the tails and the pins. And then to actually remove them from the piece, you're going to need a coping saw, because this will allow you to actually make a curved cut to remove the waste from your piece. By virtue of this being a curved cut, you're actually going to have a little bit left that this doesn't get, and that's where you're going to need a chisel to come in and actually clean up some of the waste that gets left behind from the coping saw. Once you've got it all cut, you can assemble it, and you'll need a mallet to hammer your pieces together, because if you use a hammer, you're going to be leaving marks on whatever piece you're working on. But a mallet, being made of wood, isn't going to leave any marks. So you're going to want a mallet. And once you're done, you've got it all glued up and assembled and ready to go. I prefer to cut my tails and pins just a little bit so that they protrude just a little bit, and then I come in afterwards with a smoothing plane and actually clean up those ends. Alright, so I actually already filmed this and then somehow managed to delete my video, so I'm going to have to redo part of this introduction. But the first thing you're going to want to do when you're laying out your tails is you need to know the thickness of each one of these boards. So you start off by putting the board on the edge here like this, and you can see that this board needs to be cut, the tails and pins need to be cut the thickness of this board. So you just put it on here and mark that line with your marking knife. You're going to do the same thing on the other side, or the same thing with the other board. So now you can see the thickness that these are going to fit into each other at, which is about 3/4 of an inch. All right, so now you need to figure out the spacing for your pins. Now I don't know the width of this board, and the width really doesn't matter at all. It's a little over 3.5 inches. But to divide that in my head, I want to have 3 tails on here, and to divide this board, this 3 and like 9/16 board into 3 even sections would be way more complicated than I'm gonna do in my head. So what you would do is take a compass and just kind of more or less set it to just guess how wide you think it might be in 3 even sections of this width on this board. You can check it by putting the corner of this pin on the, or by putting this pin on the corner of this board. There's 1, 2, and it's way too big. You can see that there's a lot of gap here. So I'm going to tighten this down some and try again. 1, 2, we're closer, but we're still not there. So tighten it down a little more. Try again. 1, 2, almost perfect. Actually a little too small, so I'm going to loosen it a little bit. 1, 2, 3. Now that's perfect. I'm going to show you up close how this looks. I'm putting this pin right on the corner of this board, setting the next pin down, turning it and checking to see where the next pin lands, and making sure that this next pin is right at the corner of the board, and it is. So I'm going to mark these lines. There's my first line. And there's my second line. Alright, so these lines, you can see that this now is divided into 3 even spaces. 1, 2, 3. You probably can't see that. I'm gonna square these lines down with a pencil so that you can see them and see what I'm talking about. And also they need to be squared down in a minute for the next step anyway. Alright, so all I did was bring the lines I marked with the compass all the way down to the depth line across here. That's the thickness of this other board. Now you can see that this is now divided evenly into 3 sections. And I was able to get all that without ever taking any measurements. I don't know how wide these are, and I didn't divide in my head anything. I just guessed using a compass until I got it accurate. And that was infinitely easier than having to try and figure it all up in your head. But I'm trying to make 3 tails, so these lines don't actually represent tails. What they represent is the middle points, or the middle line of your pins. So now that these are all divided into 3 equal sized sections, and I know that each one of these lines represents, and this edge line, both these edges, and these middle lines represent the center of pin lines. So I do need to know an exact measurement for how wide my pins are going to be. Now the widest point is going to be at the bottom, because they actually taper inwards as they go up, and that's what helps to hold a dovetail joint together. So let's say I'm going to make my pins at their widest point. They're going to be 1/2 inch wide. So I will put I usually don't use this 1/4 inch mark here, because this brass is kind of faded and it's hard to see. So I'm going to use a 1/4 inch mark between the 1 and the 2. I'm going to use this 1/4 inch mark here as my line for this. So what I'm going to do is put that 1/4 inch mark on this pin line down here towards the bottom of this depth line. And then I'm going to mark the 1 inch mark and the 1/2 inch mark on either side. Let me do this in pencil just so you can see it. But I wouldn't normally do this in pencil. So when you're doing it yourself, you know, do it with your marking knife. Of course, my pencil broke. All right, let's try this again. So put the 1/4 inch mark on your pin line, mark 1 inch and mark 1/2 inch. Now, this is going to be the width of your pin, and we're going to use this dovetail gauge to actually mark out the angle, but we're going to mark this one out next, and the ends also. So put the 1/4 inch mark, because we're trying to make 1/2 inch pins, so you need the equal distance between either side. The 1/4 is going to be the middle of a 1/2 inch pin. So you put that 1/4 inch mark on your pin line, down close to your depth line, and then mark 1 inch and 1/2 inch. And then these ends are also going to be pins, but they're going to be 1/2 pins. So what you would do is put so you're just going to mark over 1/4 inch, because it's only 1/2 of a pin, so you don't need the full pin. And then the same thing over here, you're just going to mark over 1/4 inch. So now you need to know which angle you want to use. So typically I just use the 1 in 8, but you can use basically any angle you want. These pins get smaller as they go up, and it's that angle that actually is what holds everything together, because this board can't pull out from the side if it's got this wedged shape pin that's holding it together. So keep that in mind when you're marking these. These need to be tapering inwards. So you can see if I put my gauge up to here, this side tapers out. So that's the wrong way. You don't want to mark it like that. It actually needs to be marked the other way, so that this pin is tapering outwards. If I can get it to, it's so close to the edge, it's going to be hard to mark. And I'm going to mark it with my pencil just so you can see it, but normally you need to mark this with your marking knife. And then this one is going to taper outwards or inward. It depends. I guess it depends on how you look at it. But there's one that's going to go in this way, and then the rest are going to go the other way. Well, except for that one. This one is also going to go that way. Okay, so now you can see I'm going to put P, 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 T, T, T. You can see that this shape here, where the angle is going outwards, is going to be a tail. When the angle is coming inwards, it's a pin. So you have a tail, pin, tail, pin, tail, pin. So now we have 3 evenly sized, evenly spaced tails. We're almost ready to start cutting this. I prefer to square these over, to square these lines over the top, just so you can see them more easily. And I also like to mark them on the back side. And I just put my pencil on the line that's already, the top of the line that's already here on the top of this pin, move my square over to it, and then square it over. And do the same thing all the way across this entire board. Now you see how this has all been squared over, and then I will take my dovetail guide and mark my lines on this side as well. Alright, so I've got my tails and pins laid out, squared over the top, and then traced back across the backside. So it's time to start cutting. Now, just to help me make sure that I don't screw this up, the best way to do this is to mark your pins that you're going to be cutting out with just little X's, just so you know not to cut this. Don't cut this and don't cut this, because these are your tails. You want to keep them intact. Now, your saw the saw blade has a thickness to it. So since you're trying to preserve the entire width of these tails, you want to make sure you're cutting on the waist side of your line. So when I'm cutting, let's say I'm cutting this pin right here out. I hope you can see this. Let's say I'm cutting this pin out. I want to make sure that my saw is just a hair on this side of the line. Because if I get on this side, if I'm right on the line, then the thickness of my saw is removing material from my tail. So you don't want to be directly on the line. You want to be just a hair over to the waist side of the line. All right, so now we're going to start cutting this. Just put it in your vise. Get your dovetail saw, and remember, you've marked X's on the parts you're taking out, and you need to cut on that side, the waist side of each one of these, so that you're not damaging your tails. You want to preserve the integrity of your tails through the entire process. All right, so my hand is probably going to be in the way for you to see this, but what I would do is use my thumb to kind of guide the saw in any direction, left or right. And I'm trying to just set the saw down just a tiny little bit away from my line. And again, I'm using my thumb as a sort of guide. And I'm going to set it there and start the cut, making sure I'm on the waist side of the line. You can see, hopefully, I've started the cut here. You can see this area that I've cut, and you can still see my line. So I'm well on the waist side, or this side, of my tail. And I want to continue to cut like that on all of these. you're just cutting down to the line that you made that shows the thickness of that other board. You do the same thing on each of these. Alright, so the next thing I would do is cut off these end pins. Since you already scored a line all the way around here, you can see the line that you need to cut. Maybe if it'll focus. You can see this line is the line you need to cut to remove these end pins. So, just put it in the vise sideways and make a cut on that line. There's one pin. There's the other one. Alright, so now we've got to remove these center pins, and you'll have to use a coping saw for those. So put it in the vise, take your coping saw, put it in the cut that you've already made with your dovetail saw, and begin to turn the saw a little bit as you cut, and it will start to cut at an angle and curve around. Ultimately, what you're trying to do is cut as close to this line on the bottom, your depth line, as you can get. You don't want to go past it, obviously, because then you're going to have problems. But so you can't start all the way down at the bottom corner. You got to start up just a little ways to be able to get that initial curve started. So you're going to start cutting and turning the saw as you cut. And again, you're trying to stay pretty close to this line at the bottom to cut that pin out. Now you can see, maybe you can see. So I'm going to do this next one, and then I'll show you the wood that needs to be cleaned out, because it's not, there's still some wood in here that doesn't need to be here. So put your saw, your coping saw in, not all the way at the bottom, because if you start at the bottom, you're going to cut into the piece too far. So start up just a little ways, start cutting and turning at the same time. And once you get level with that line, just follow your depth line across until your pin pops out. Alright, so now you can see your pins have been removed, but there's this little bit of wood here in each corner from the cope where you had to start turning the coping saw. There's that little bit there in each one of these corners, and that will need to be cleaned out. And also, you can see that I'm not on my line in some of these. Some of these tails, you can see my pencil line is a little further away from the actual cut line. So I will also clean some of that up with the chisel. But I'll start off by paring that little bit of wood in those corners out. You got to get these corners as clean as you can, because that's a lot of times where, when you start to assemble this, a lot of times it's the corners where you start having problems getting it fitted properly. So you're really wanting to make sure you get those corners clean. So these are pretty much cleaned up and ready to go. Now I'm going to transfer these pin lines, or these marks where these empty spaces where the pins are going to be, onto my other board. So put my board in the vise, take some sort of flat surface, lay the board I've already cut the tails on the flat surface. Make sure this is all level, or flat at least. Alright, so I'm laying this board that I've already cut my tails on my mallet, just so I'll have a flat surface that I can press down on. I'm lining all this up. This edge is lined up smooth with this edge is lined up smooth with this edge, and the gap between this bottom corner of this board and this back top corner of this board, I want to make sure that these are lined up as closely as I can get them to be. And I don't really... I don't know how well you're going to be able to see that. Once it's all lined up, I'll take my marking knife, and I'm pressing down pretty hard on here because I don't want this to slide around anywhere. So I take my marking knife and put it flush So I'll take my marking knife and put it flush up against this side of this pin and mark the angle of this pin onto the surface or the end grain of this board. And I do the same thing inside these pins or inside these tails on all of them. Alright, so you probably won't be able to see that, so I'm going to mark it all again. I'm going to mark over it with pencil so that you can see it. But I'm just going to use my marking gauge. I'm going to put my pencil in the line that I just made with my marking knife, and I'm going to mark these lines so that you can see them. Alright, so now you can see my pin lines. Now what I'm taking out here, what I'm going to be removing from here is the tails, or these bigger sections here. What I'm going to be leaving is these pins this time, so it's the opposite of the last time. Just like I did on the last one. Now what I would do is square all these over down to my depth line. I'm just going to use a pencil. Again, you should probably use your marking knife, but just for the sake of making it easier for you to see, I'm going to use a pencil. Alright, so I've marked it around on both sides, so I know these places here is what I'm actually going to be removing. So it's the exact same process we just did with the tails. You put it in your vise, get your dovetail saw, and cut it on the waste side, or the side that's going to be removed from this board. same thing as before. Go through the chisel and make sure these corners are clear. Make sure you're down to your line, your depth line. And then do a little trial fit and see if there's anything you need to be, any adjustments you need to make. And I can see I do need to adjust a little. And then put it all together. Make sure it's all the way on. And there it is. Now I would glue this. If I was going to be making this into something, I might glue it. Also, like I said before, you might go over it with a plane and just clean this up. Alright, so that's it. That is, I guess you would call these would be through dovetails, since they go all the way through both sections of wood. But it's pretty much that simple. I would, if I was making this into something, I would glue this up just to give it, some additional strength. But, I mean, that's a pretty sturdy joint, even with no glue at all. It's not going to go anywhere. This joint would, if it was glued up, oiled, and whatever it was taken care of, this joint will last, another 100 years. So that's going to be it for this week, guys. I'll be back next week. I'm not sure what I'm doing yet, but I will see you guys next week.